Shadcn just deprecated their form component and replaced it with a brand new field component that is completely different. In this video, I will cover all the concepts and new components you need to know in order to convert from the old form component to the new field component. Most importantly, I will also show you how to use this field component with both React Hook form and TanStack form, since by default it has no library support. But that isn't all, because I will also show you how to create super clean and reusable components that take your forms from this messy boilerplate on the left to this concise and easy to maintain code on the right. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. By the end of this video, we're going to have this complete form that has text boxes, select elements, checkbox groups, and even dynamic array-based fields, as well as error message handling and everything else you could possibly want. Now, to get started, we have a little bit of boilerplate code already created for us. You can see here we have a page that's completely blank. That's just a client page. We have a simple schema, which is using Zod, that just has a project that has a name. Obviously, we're going to expand upon this as we go, but we want to get started with the most basic form possible. And then finally, we have a server action. Since we're doing this in Next.js, doesn't matter what language you use, but we have a server action that handles what this code does. And you can see this just returns true or false depending on if it was successful. And then obviously you would have some like database code or so on inside of here, but really all we care about is the form side of things. So we're really going to be focusing most of our time inside this section of our page. The very first way I want to implement this field component is using React Hook form, because that's the way the form component inside of Shadcn works by default. So the very first thing we need to do is use the use form hook that comes directly from that library. So we'll get use form just like this. And let's make sure that we import this. And we want to get that from, and that is React Hook form. There we go. We're also going to need to import our Zod validator, and that's going to be directly from at the hook form resolvers. And we want to get the Zod one specifically. So let's come in here, /Zod, and then we can get that Zod resolver. So now what we can do with our use form right here is we can put all of our different default values in. So we can say default values, and we know our default value is just a string that is an empty. And there we go. We can get our form just like that. And then for our type, we need to make sure we type this properly. We can say that this is going to be the type of z.infer, and that z needs to come from Zod. So let's make sure we import that from Zod. And we can get here the type of, and we want to get our product schema. There we go. Let's close all this off. This one does not need to be a type of, so we can remove that. And then let's just import this product schema. Whoops, product schema from actually we can just say @/schemas/project. There we go. It's project schema. That's why it wasn't auto importing. There we go. So now we have our project schema. We have our form. We just need to make sure that we hook up our resolver, which is our Zod resolver. So now we're making sure that everything is using Zod, and we have all of our code up here for our project schema. We just need to make sure we pass that schema to our resolver, and now we have everything hooked up, and we have a form with a single input inside of it. Now, if we were using the old form way of doing things, we would need to come down here and create the form component directly from that. And then inside that form component, we would need to use things like form control and form field and so on. But we don't have any of that because this new field component section is much more stripped back. There's not nearly as many bells and whistles built into it. And that's because it doesn't conform to any library at all. So we can use a normal form component just like we would with any type of library. And we can come in here with our onSubmit, and that is going to be the handle submit for this. So we can say form.handleSubmit, and we can pass it in our own onSubmit function. So we can just come in here and say onSubmit. And for this onSubmit function, we just have some data inside of here, and that is going to be that exact same z.infer of our project schema. There we go. Now the actual code for this doesn't really matter. All we're going to be doing is we're going to be calling that server action that I showed you at the beginning of the video. And then with that server action, we're either going to say success or error based on if it was a successful or an error response. So that's all that this section of our code is doing, relatively straightforward. Now inside of our actual form section, I do want to come in here and just wrap it inside of a really simple div. And this div is just going to make sure that we have proper spacing set up. So it just puts us in a container with some spacing on the edges, just so things aren't too cramped onto the edges of our page. And now if I just put some content inside of here, for example, hi, that should show up on our page over here. Now, as you can see, we get that text hi showing up. It's a little bit small, but that's perfectly okay for now. Now let's go ahead and move on to creating our very first actual field input using this new field component. The first thing we need to do is to set up a field group. So we can come in here with a field group, just like that. And to make sure we have this component, we actually need to make sure we install this. So we can say npx shadcn at latest. we want to add the field component. That's going to add all the new different field components that we have, and there's actually quite a lot of them. So once we have that done, we should be able to import this. And if we actually look at the file here and scroll to the top, you can see, like I said, there's a lot. We have a field set, which is just based on the field set normal HTML element. Same with field legend, that's just based on our legend element. Field group is the one we just created. This essentially just adds spacing between our elements. You can see here the big thing is that we have a gap between our different elements, and it has the ability to have this different gap sizings based on different things such as a checkbox group and so on. So you can see we have nice gap stuff going on. Then we have down here our field, and our field can either be a vertical or horizontal field, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Field content is for putting text like a label or a title or a description. And then finally, we have a field separator to separate different elements, a field error to show out all of our different errors, and then at the bottom, it's just exporting all those different things. So you can see there's a lot of stuff that goes into these field components. There's tons and tons of components, even more than we had in the previous version of the form. But for the most part, field group is what you want to wrap all of your different components inside of. You can see here, if I just have some divs that says hi and another one that says hi, you can see they have default space between them. That's what this field group does. If I remove that field group, you can see they're pushed up against each other. So all this really does is add spacing between elements. So I like to have all of my field elements wrapped in at least one field group. The next thing we need to do is to specify our actual field. So we can say field just like that. And this is where all of our different field related elements are going to go, such as the label and so on. So we need to have a field label. So let's come in here with a field label. And then we also need to put what that label is. Let's just say that this is going to be a name. The next thing we need to have is some type of input element. We can use whatever we want. Any type of custom component or element works. You can even use a normal input. I'm just going to use using the built-in Shadcn input component. So now we have an input directly below that. We have some nice spacing because they're inside this field component that sets up that spacing for us. And then finally, if we have any errors, we can put them inside of a field error component, which takes in some errors just like this. And these errors are going to be an array. So if I put some like text inside of here for my error, and I give it a save, it's not going to render because this actually expects certain things, which is going to be an object that contains a message property. So if I just say hi, you can see we get that nice little error showing up down here since we have this error message. Now this is pretty much the anatomy of almost every field you're going to deal with, at least a basic one. It's going to have a label, it's going to have some type of input, and then it's going to have some type of error message that shows on the screen. Now what I want to do in this particular section is I want to wrap this all inside of a controller, which is from React Hook Form, so that we can hook up everything properly. And this is what that form library does behind the scenes for us. So I'm going to wrap this entire field inside of this controller component. And to do that, we can use a property called render. This render property is actually a function. So it's a function that takes in a bunch of different parameters, and then it's going to output some code for us. And that code is going to be all of this right here. So that entire field goes directly inside this section. And this render section gives us, for example, the field as well as the field state. So we can modify how our component works inside of here with this field and field state. Also, our controller needs to have a name. This is just corresponding with whatever our form is up here. So you can see we have our name element here. So we called that name. And also we need to pass along a control. So this control is just going to be our form.control. It comes directly from our form element again. And that gives us type safety because now I can only input whatever properties we have up here. We have name. If I were to add age, for example, which is going to be a number, then I can come down here and I would have age as a property available. Right now I don't because I don't have that in my Zod schema, so the types aren't correct, but you can see here we have name, which is working perfectly fine. So now with that done, you can see everything is still looking the same on our side. We just need to make sure we hook up these field and field state with all the properties inside of our field. So the very first thing we need to do on our field is it has a property called data invalid. This data invalid property is going to be true or false depending on if the data is essentially valid or not. So we can get our field state dot invalid, and that'll just return true if we have an invalid input, and it's going to return false if we have a valid input. So now I have a way to check the validity of this particular element. And this is going to add some nice CSS styles that we'll see in a little bit. If I were to just to manually set this to true, you can see it changes the highlight of this to red. So it changes my label's text color and everything like that. We'll change it back so it's dynamically assigned by this field state. Next, for our field label, we want to make sure that this field label is hooked up to the import. When I click on this actual field label, I want it to highlight this input down here. So to do that, for my field label, I need to use the HTML4 element. And generally, the easiest way to do this is just take our field name that should be unique inside your application, and that is going to correspond as the ID for our input. So if we just give this our field.name as well, as long as these two elements match, now when I click on my name, it actually highlights inside my input, which just hooks those up and makes it work properly with assistive technology, and it makes it easier for people using a mouse to just click on the label and get inside the input. Now, another nice thing about this field property is it has a bunch of other things. You can see we have disabled, on blur, on change, ref, and value. So I can actually take all of those properties and pass them into my input just like this. So now it hooked up my onChange and all my other event listeners directly to my input so I can have those available inside my code. So when I change, for example, the value inside of here, it updates the state inside of my form component up here inside my application. The next thing we can do is we can use this area invalid property. This again is what essentially this data invalid is, but it's for the input. It allows me to have the correct styling for this. So if I were to just come into here and I set that to field state.invalid, now that's going to properly style this particular section based on what's valid or not valid. Again, if I just manually set this to true real quick and I give that a save, you can see we get a red outline around our input telling us that it is invalid. But of course, I want to actually have it hooked up to a dynamic value in my code. Finally, I can do the exact same thing with our error messages down here. Field state.error. This is going to give me my error in the correct format that Shadcn expects. I just need to make sure I wrap it in an array because it expects an array of errors, and I just have a single error right here. And I only want to show my errors if I have one. So if my field state.invalid, that means that I have an error. So I want to render out that error to the screen. So we can just wrap that inside this section checking invalidity. Now, if I have an invalid input, it should actually show me those errors. So to test that, let's actually add a button to our page. We can come in here with a simple button, and this button is just going to say create, just like that, and this will attempt to submit my form. So if I just click create like this, you can notice immediately I get my error message showing up, I get the error colors on everything, I get automatically focused on this particular input element, and if I change it to something that is valid and I click create, you can now see project created successfully, and it passes in the information, and then it cleared out my form because if we look all the way up inside of our submit, you can see we're just doing a form.reset, which resets everything inside of our form back to the default values. Now let's make this a little bit more complicated by adding in a text area that includes a description. So inside of our schema here, let's add a description. There we go. And this description should be a string. This string is optional, and we're just going to have a simple transform here, which is going to take our value. And if our value is an empty string, it converts it to undefined. So essentially, if I pass in an empty string, it converts it to undefined. That way I don't store empty strings inside my database. Now inside my code, I need to make sure that I include my description, which will just set to an empty string. Now we are getting a bit of a type error right here. We can essentially just remove this check right there for our actual hard-coded generic, and that does solve the problem we have. So now we have a default value for our empty description, and we can go ahead here and actually just copy down this entire controller because for the most part, our code is going to be very similar. We need to change this name to description. We want to change our label to say description, but all this other boilerplate is staying exactly the same. Our data invalid, our HTML4, all these field components, our ID, our area invalid, and our field error section all stay exactly the same. The only difference is I'm going to be using a text area section here. So now we have our description, but I want to add in some description to my description. So essentially a little bit of text. I can come in here with a field description, and this allows me to add whatever I want. I can say like be specific as possible. There we go. We'll say be as specific as possible. And that adds this nice little description here. And I can move this around wherever I want. For example, I could put it down here in between these sections and it's going to be above my error, or I could put it down below my error if I really wanted. In our case, you generally want to have it next to the label, which is what we have here. And in the case where you have this text next to a label, they actually have another component called field content that allows you to make the spacing a little bit tighter. So you can see here, I just wrap the label and description in this field content component, and that's just going to tighten up the spacing between these pieces of text. So anytime you have multiple pieces of text next to each other, it's advised that you wrap it in a field content. And when I save, you'll notice the spacing between these elements just tightens up slightly. It's not a ton, but of course you can go in, and this is Shadcn, you can change whatever you want. I can go inside of here and I could change the gap to be smaller. And now when I do that, you can see they get even closer together. It's entirely up to what you want. But again, we have multiple pieces of text together in your form. It's advised that you wrap them in this field content component. But again, it's entirely optional. If you don't like the styling of that, just go ahead and remove it and it'll look like it did before. But I think it's nice that they are snug a little bit closer together. Now, so far, we've only covered really the basics of like a text area and another text component, nothing too complicated. So I want to move on to something a little bit more complicated, which is dealing with a select component. So we're going to come in here. We're just going to create a bunch of project statuses. You can see we have 3 different statuses. And then I'm going to create a simple enum right here that is just going to be looping through those project statuses. So if we go over to our page and we scroll all the way up to the top here, we need to make sure that we add in a status. And the particular status that we're going to be using is draft. So now we essentially have a draft status by default. And if I just set this to a constant variable, that'll fix all the errors that I have down there because essentially it was defaulting it to a string, but now it's just that draft context. Now to set up our actual field section, it's going to be very similar. We'll copy over this entire controller because again, it's very similar between each one of these, but this one is going to be for our status. Our label is going to say status. All of our different labels, data invalid, errors is all going to stay the same. The section that's going to change is this middle section on our input. We want to use the select component instead, and we actually need to make quite a few different changes to what we had before. So we're going to have our select, we're going to have our select trigger. This should all look very familiar if you're used to Shadcn. Our select value is going to be the next thing that we're going to have. Close that off. Then we're going to have our select content after this, and inside of our select content, we're going to take our project statuses. We want to map through each status, and inside of here, I'm going to render out a select item. There we go. My key is my status. My value is my status. And then we can actually come in here with the text, which is again just going to be our status, and that'll look perfectly fine. So now we have our select hooked up. You can see that I can come in here and I can modify the value, but of course it's not getting my default value or anything like that because we haven't hooked up these field properties. So the very first thing on our select is we can pass in all of the different field properties. But this won't work exactly like we expect because a field actually has an onValue change property instead of the onChange property. So what I want to do here for my field is instead I want to extract out specific properties. I want to get the onChange property from here, and then the rest of the properties I just want to leave inside a variable called field. So essentially field includes all the original variables, blur, value, disabled, name, and ref, but it took onChange out of it. So now I can use onChange inside this onValue change. So now anytime that I change what my value is, it's going to update. And you can see by default, this default value is selected. And if I change it and I were to submit my form, you can see if I just give that a quick save, that it has a status of active right here, and then my description and my name. So it is properly taking that into account. Now I'm getting a little bit of an error. That's because my description here needs to be optional. So we'll say optional. Just like that. That should hopefully fix that error. So now if I type in an optional description, you can see here I get my name and I get my status, and the description is just left off completely. Now another thing that we need to modify is this select property doesn't actually have an onBlur. We need to take the onBlur and move it somewhere else. So our select trigger here is where we're going to put all of that code. So we're going to say onBlur on this is just equal to that onBlur variable that we took out. So now that hooks up that function for the event listener properly. We also need to specify an ID, which is just going to be our field.name. So that ID is hooked up on the correct element, because that means when I click on here, if I give that a quick save, if I click on my status, it actually selects me inside of here and I can use the arrow keys. And again, it makes sure everything's hooked up properly for assistive technologies. Now, the last thing we need to hook up here is going to be our area invalid, just like we were doing for all of our other inputs. So I can say area invalid is going to be equal to our field state.invalid. And now that is hooked up properly as well. So if we have an error on this, we will get the nice highlighting around it. So as you can see, these types of elements are relatively easy to set up when you just have a label, a description, and some type of thing like a select or a text area. But what happens when we want to get a little bit more complicated? We haven't dealt with any of the extra components like a field set or a field legend. So I want to move on to that next by dealing with a bunch of different checkboxes. So down here, I want to create a field set, which allows me to essentially create a subset of different elements that are all inside of one thing, and I can disable them and enable them and make them all essentially one group. And it's really good for assistive technology as well, because then they know, hey, these are all grouped together inside this one field set. And field sets can have legends and titles and labels and so on. So inside of my schema, I essentially want to create a brand new section for that. We're going to call this notifications, and this is going to be a z.object, and this object is going to have a few properties. We're going to have email, which is going to be a Boolean. And then we're just going to copy this down a couple of times, because essentially we're going to have three different ways we can be notified. We're going to have SMS for text messages, and then we're going to have push notifications for like in-app notifications. So these three checkboxes, we want them to be able to check as many or as few as they want to be notified for different things inside the project. You can imagine this in pretty much any project. You're going to have something similar to this. So now let's go ahead and make sure we get that field set imported. And inside this field set, we're going to have a field legend, which kind of acts as what the title for this section is. So we're going to call it notifications. So now you can see we get that notifications title showing up. And then directly below that, we're going to have our field description. And this is just going to describe what this section is. So I'm just going to copy over some text, select how you would like to receive notifications. You can see those are showing up right next to each other. And I can even wrap this inside of a field content. That way they share the exact same spacing as this top section does. So it looks a little bit more coherent with the other stuff inside of our application. Now, if you want to have a bunch of checkboxes really close to each other, the nice thing is we can use that field group component, and it actually has an ability, which we can call data slot. And if we set this data slot to checkbox group, that's going to change the actual spacing of our elements to make them much closer together. So again, if I come in here with two divs, we'll just say hi and hi, you can see that they're quite close together. If I remove this data slot right here, you can see they're now further apart. And the spacing for this works out really well for essentially a bunch of different checkboxes that show up one after another. So for each of these, we're essentially going to create a brand new controller element. So I'm going to come down here, copy this down, and this very first one is going to be for notifications.email. That's the very first thing that we want inside of our controller. And here, instead of doing a text area for this one, we're going to be doing a checkbox. Now for this checkbox, I can get rid of all my descriptions and everything. The only thing I care about is my label, which will just say email for this particular section. There we go. And then inside of this checkbox, we want to modify what we pass in. First of all, we want to pass in all of our field properties, but again, field contains stuff that checkbox doesn't. For example, the value and the on change are going to be slightly different. What we want to do is we want to hook up our value property, which in our case is the checked property. Let's make sure that we import our checkbox properly. There we go. So we want to get that checked property. That's going to be set to our value because that is a Boolean. And then on our change, which is going to be on check changed, there we go, we can set that to on value change, which we just have set to on change. There we go. So now that's at least hooking those elements up properly. And to make sure I get the rest of my field properties, we can come in here just like that. Now I still need to set up my ID, which is going to be our field.name. And I need to be able to set up my area invalid, which is just going to be field state.invalid. There we go. Those need to be on every single input that we use to get the proper styling. But that right there does clean this up, but you'll notice our styling is super messed up. There's a few reasons for that. First of all, on our field element here, we need to specify that we want the orientation to be horizontal. So we can come in here with an orientation of horizontal, make sure I get that in the correct location, and that's going to put these side by side. But now you can see our element for our text is on the left, checkbox is way on the right, usually not what you want. So we're just going to take our field label and we're going to move it below our checkbox just like that. And now you can see that they're side by side just like this. Now also when we're using this horizontal method like this error is going to show up to the right of our label, which is really not what we want. So instead I'm going to wrap this inside of a field content. So essentially our error is going to show up directly below our label if we have an error. So if I were to just come in here and I were to manually specify an error, just so I can show you what that looks like, we can come in here, message, test, and if I close that off, we can now see that the error message is showing up directly before, while if I did not have that in a field content, you can see it's pushed off all the way to the side, which obviously doesn't look great. So this is essentially how we set up a checkbox now. And the really nice thing is to set up another checkbox, we essentially just copy this entire thing, paste it down, and this one, for example, can be SMS. We can change the label here to be text, just like that. And other than that, everything should be exactly the same. So now we have the ability to check these checkboxes independent of each other. And if I check text and I don't check email, you can see when I try to create this, we're getting a little bit of an error because I believe I need to add in my final input to here, which is going to be the one for push notifications. So we can say in app. There we go. So that way it has a valid value. So now we can see text and in-app should be set to true. And if I click create, you can see emails false, SMS, and push are both set to true. So this is working like we expect it to. Now we're not resetting to our default values. So all the way up here at the very top when we have this section, I want to make sure for notifications that we set email to false, push to false, and I set SMS to false. That way when I actually reset my form, if I were to just type these in and give these a couple values, and click create, it resets those to their default value, just like we want them to. Now, the final thing in our schema that I want to set up before we start really optimizing this form and worrying about TanStack is I want to add in a users array. So this is going to be handling dynamic arrays of content and data inside of our application. It's just an array that has some emails inside of it as an object form. So now we can set that up inside of our application. First of all, we can give it a default value. And this default value is just going to have an empty array as our very first value, so we at least have one element in there. And in our schema, you can see we have a minimum of one value that's required and a maximum of 5 different values that are required. So we can have between 1 and 5 people inside of our array. Now in React hook form to set up an array, we need to use the useFieldArray function. This takes in our control, which is our form.control, and it also takes in the name of this, which is our users array that we have. Then it's going to give us a bunch of information. And that information we can just extract out here. We have our fields, we have our append, and we have our remove. And I always like to rename these. So this one is going to be our users, append is going to be add user, and remove is going to be remove user. So at least we have nice, easy to read names for what each of these different things is going to do. This is our list of users, this is the function to make a new one, and this is the function to remove an existing user from our list. Now all the way down at the very bottom of our code, underneath of all of our checkbox stuff, this is where I want to put that list section. And I want to separate it. So I'm going to use a nice little field separator to separate this. And you can see we get this nice little horizontal line that shows up to separate this content from the rest. And this is going to be like a little bit of a final boss almost, because it's going to incorporate everything we've talked about from all the other different components. So the first thing we want to have here is going to be a field set to wrap all of this different content. This is for the exact same reason I had a field set up here with our checkboxes. I essentially want to have an overall label for everything. Now I'm going to wrap this inside of a div for some spacing related stuff, but we can come in here with our field content, which is going to have our field legend. And our field legend for this one is going to be a variant of label. This essentially just makes it so that it's a little bit smaller text. You notice how this notifications text is a little bit larger than the text that we have up here for description? That's because it's using the variant of legend. If we use the variant of label, it'll look much more like an actual label. We can also modify the class name by removing the margin on the bottom to push it a little bit closer to the other content to more closely emulate what we have in this top section. Now for our field legend, we can just say user email addresses. There we go. So now you can see we have that text and it's much smaller because it's using that label formatting instead. We can also come in here with a field description, and I'm just going to copy over the description that I have, which is add up to 5 users. And you can see these pieces of text are very close together, just like the text that we have up here for our description, because again, we're using the proper label variants and so on. Now underneath of this section right here, I also want to render out any errors that I have. So I'm going to say form.formState.errors.user, and I want to check to see if there's any root errors at all. These are going to be errors for like, is my array too long? Is my array too short? And so on. If I have any of those errors, then I want to render out my field error, and my errors is essentially just going to be this entire section inside of an array. There we go. So now I'm rendering out any errors if I have too many or too few users inside this section. Now I mentioned that I'm going to wrap this inside of a div, and that's because I'm going to be putting a button over here. This button is just going to be a type of button. It's going to have a variant, which is going to be outline. We're going to have it be a size of small, so it's a little bit smaller. And most importantly, when we click on this, what I want to do is I want to call a function, add a user. I want to add a brand new user, and the users are going to have an empty email, just like that. So we're just going to be adding a brand new user to our page with an empty email, and this will say add user. So now you can see we have that add user button, and to space everything out properly, I'm just going to come in here, make it flex, justify the content between with a gap of 2 and the items in the center. That just pushes my button off to the right hand side, and now when I click it, it should be adding brand new users to our array, but we're not rendering out what those users look like, so we should probably go ahead and do that. Inside this field set, we can use a field group that's going to give us that nice spacing that we really want to have through all of our different elements. And we can loop through each one of our users, which is going to give us a user and an index. And then we can render out the content for that. And of course, we're going to need to use a controller just like we've used inside the rest of our application. So I'm going to scroll up to our very top controller, which is just a normal basic input, because that's what all of these elements are. And you'll see there's a lot of similarities between these. So let's paste in that entire controller section here. For our name, we're going to need to dynamically create this name because it's going to be users dot, and then we want to get the index. So we can say index, and then we can put another dot, and we can say we want to specify specifically the email element. We also need to set a key on here, which we can get from our user. We can just say user.id to give us an ID for the key. Now, if we remove this label for name because we don't actually need that, and we scroll down, you can see that we have these text boxes right here. And every time I click add user, a brand new text box gets added to the end of my list. So at least we know that that section is working just like we expect it to. The next thing that I want to do is to make it so we can remove elements from here. So instead of using a basic input, I'm instead going to be using an input group, which is actually a brand new component inside of Shadcn. And this input group allows me to do a bunch of things. First of all, I can have an input group input. That's just a standard input element. And this input group input should essentially just take all of these different components for what our field is and so on. And we also need to specify a type here because this is an email. And I should give this a label as well. So we can say area label, and this area label will be dynamically generated. It'll say user index +1 email. So it'll say like user 1 email, user 2 email, and so on. So now I have that done. I have my input group input. The next thing I can do is I can add an add-on, because right now you can see everything is exactly the same as it is before. But if I come in here with an input group add-on, that allows me to add, for example, a button. And I can say where I want this to align. I can say I want this to align at inline end. That's just going to show up at the very end of my element. And here I can put that input group button, which allows me to create a button in my element, for example, closing out of whatever this thing is. So I can just put in here an X icon. There we go. Now if I give that a save, you can see I have this X icon on the right hand side, and I can modify the styles of this by making it a type of button. The variant of this one is going to be ghost. I want to give it a size here, which is going to be icon extra small. And then we can come in here with an on click to make it so that it actually removes the user. So we can say remove, whoops, make sure I get all that spelled properly. remove user, which takes in the index of the user we want to remove, which we already have access to. And we should also give this a label. So I'm going to copy over this label, paste it down, and this will just say remove user, and then whatever the index of that user is. So now we at least have all of that in place. And when I click on this, you can see that it's removing those elements from our list, which is exactly what we want. And we can remove all the way down to 0 if we really want. So let's go ahead and test this. We'll just refresh our page to start with the basic level. And we hit create here, you can see here, invalid email address, which is what we expect. And up here, we get an error. So let's fix the error up here. Let's fix the error right here with just a random email address and click create. And you can see it passes along all that information. Now let's go ahead and try to delete this. So now we're missing one of our user elements. If I click create, you can see we get the error message showing up properly. It must have at least one element. And when I come in here and I fix that error, click create, you can now see it passed along all of our information. The only reason we get these errors showing up is because I clicked create twice. Obviously that's going to throw an error because it gave us the default form and I clicked create a second time by accident. Now, obviously this code is a little bit of a pain to write, especially when we have a lot of really simple things. For example, a controller for a simple input. You can see everything for our field, our label, our errors, and the fields we pass to our input are exactly the same. All we really need to determine is what is the label, what is the description, and what is the name of our input, and everything else should just be handled automatically. And this is where creating this extra level is really, really important. So I want to come into our components. I'm going to create a brand new file. We're just going to call this one form.tsx. And this is where we're essentially going to replace all that boilerplate. So I'm going to export a function. We're going to call this one form input. And this form input function, right now we can just have it return null. So it just has some type of return. But essentially what I want to do is I want to take wherever I have this controller, I want to replace the entire thing with just a form input that has a name, which is name, and a label, which is also name in our particular case. And that's it. This entire section of code I want to be replaced by essentially this. And of course, we also need to pass along the form element we're using. So in here, we could say control is equal to form.control. That's going to make sure that we have all of our type safety hooked up. So essentially, I want to take all of this code and I want to replace it by this one single little line. And let's just make sure we import this properly. So now let's go ahead and try to figure out how do we do that, because this is the code we're replacing. We of course can import all the different stuff we're using, all these different components, because we're going to need all of these components, including the input, and finally this field error down here. We just need to make sure we have access to our control and everything else, which is going to be a little bit of complicated TypeScript code. So let's create a type that handles these props for us. We're going to create this type form control props, and this is going to be the props for all of our form controls. If it's an input, a text area, checkbox, it doesn't matter. And this section is going to actually be a generic. And that's because if we take a look at this, the type we want to use for control is going to be a controller props. We essentially want to get the props for our controller because that's the thing that we're going to be specifically setting. And if we look at controller props, you can see it has this massive generic inside of it. I'm actually going to take everything inside this generic, copy it, and paste it up here. And if we give this a quick save, you'll notice that essentially it has 3 different sections inside of it. We have our field values, our name, and the transformed values. We also need to import a few things that we're using inside of here, but essentially I'm just taking whatever the generic values are that come from this controller props, and I'm putting them inside my own element. So I can use those exact same generics here. The field values, I can use the name, and I can use the transformed values, and that's going to essentially give me all of my normal controller props. And I only want to get the control portion from here, so I can just get the control portion just like that. That's going to give me the type safety for this control. And if I come into here and I say props, and I set this equal to our form control props, that at least should clean up our error if we change this to control. There we go. You can see that the error for this has been completely removed. Now we also need to specify that we have a name property inside of here, as well as a label, and technically a description if we really want that. But for now, I just care about label because we want to put the label there, and the name is going to go in this section right here, just to make sure that this is as generic as possible. So up inside of here, we need to have a name, which is going to be some type we don't know yet. And we also need to have a label, which we at least know is going to be some type of React node. So we can just say React node. Now, the nice thing about our name is we have this tName property right here, which is automatically inferred for us to give us only the names that are valid for our application. So if we come into here and we look at our code, we can see that we do have some errors going on inside of our code. The reason for these errors is because inside of here, we have all these generics, but we're not using them. So essentially we need to copy all of this generic information into our form input section. And we need to pass each of these along to our field here. So tName and tTransformed values. Essentially, we're just making sure we propagate these generics through all of our code. So we're passing them into our form input. Those go to our form controller props, which go to our controller props, and make sure all of our type safety is hooked up. So now you can see we have no more errors. And the great thing is inside here, I get full type safety for the only things that are available. So now I have this form input. And actually, if I save my code, you'll notice over here, my name input is exactly the same. I still get my error handling. And if I were to actually submit with some real valid data, you can see it passes along that name with the correct information inside of it. So we at least see that this is now working. I can pass along just a form input like this and everything hooks up properly. So now let's go back into our form section and try to make this a little bit easier to work around, because all of our essentially components are going to have a controller, they're going to have a field, they're going to have a label, and they're going to have an error message. We want to make this as generic as possible. So we can just create a function called form base. And this form base is essentially going to return all of this content. The only thing that's different is this input field is going to be modified based on whatever children we want to be able to pass into it. So let's create the types for this prop. We can come in here and say that we have our form base props, and our form base props is going to use the exact same triple generic. So we need to make sure we copy that over. And then inside of here, this is actually going to essentially use our form control props. So we can say form control props, just like that. Again, passing along all the generic values that we have inside of here. So those are all properly propagated. And then we just want to add on some additional props that only this base section are using. And really the only thing we care about is our children. Now in our case, for the children, we're going to be using a render prop specifically. So what I can do for this children property is I can actually make it a function. This function is going to take a field property, and this field property is going to be whatever our parameters are coming from our controller props. There we go. And we need to pass along all of the different generic properties inside of here. So let's make sure we get our T field name, T name, and our transformed values just like that. I specifically want to get that render property. That's what we use inside of our code here to render out whatever is inside of our controller. So we want to get the render property directly from the children. Now I'm going to clean up this code slightly. We can get rid of that specific parameter there, and I can close this off. Inside this parameters, I want to get the very first parameter because there is only one parameter, and I specifically want to get the field section from it because that's the only thing I care about is the field properties. Now this is going to return to me a React node. So essentially all I've done is I've said that this children function takes in our field, just like that, and it's going to return to us a React node. So if I were to actually come in here and get my props from here by saying children, and those are going to be my form base props, just like that. And again, I use all of my different generic values. So let's copy those up into here and make sure that I pass those along, T name and T transformed values. You can now see that we still have some errors. That's because I need to get my other properties out of here as well. So let's come in here with our control, our label, and our name. That cleans all that up. And now you notice when I call children, I just need to pass it in that field and everything's going to work fine. We'll see where that comes into effect in a little bit, but I want to clean this up slightly because if we go down to our input, you'll notice that we pass in our ID and the area invalid, and that gets passed along to every single element that we use. Checkboxes, selects, it doesn't matter. We always pass those along. So I actually want to include those inside this field component here. So I can say that we're going to have an area invalid. This must be a Boolean. And then we're going to have an ID that is a string. And this is just going to make it a little bit easier to hook all this up because now this field element is going to include those different values. We just need to make sure that we pass them along. So we have our entire field, our ID, which we know is our field name, and then we have our area invalid, which is just going to be equal to field state.invalid, just like that. So that just hooks up those informations right there, so we don't need to do it down in this section here. So now let's take a look at how easy this actually made our code to work with. You can see that all of our boilerplate controller, field, label, and everything, the only thing we have is our input. That's the only thing we need to set. So I can remove everything from here that is not my input element, and what I can do instead is I can take my form base and I can wrap the entire element directly inside that. Then inside this form base for my children, this actually takes in a function. This function has a field property, and it's going to return to me essentially a value. So now let's just clean up our code slightly. There we go. And we have our form base, which is passing in that children. And of course, we need to pass it in all the props that we have as well. So let's come into here and we can say that we want to take our props and pass them along. And we're just going to say props just like that. Clean that up. There we go. So now it's passing along everything that's required for this, and our ID and our area invalid are being passed in as part of this field. You can see they're inside of the type for this. So this is literally all the code that we need to write to be able to get this hooked up and working properly. You can see our form input, again, on the side is working just like we expect it to. If we give this a little submit, you can see my name is being passed along. So now all I need to do is essentially copy this down for all the different input types that I have. Now it's a little bit annoying having to write out these massive generics every single time. So I'm actually going to create a separate type that's going to make that a little bit easier to work with. This type is going to be called form control function, just like this. And this form control function is going to be equal to a function that essentially takes in all of these generic properties. So we can just take all those different generic properties. It's going to be a function that takes our props, and our props is going to be our form control props. Whoops, form control props, there we go. It's going to take in our field, our name, our transform value, just like that. And this function is going to return to us a React node. There we go. So now I have the type for this form control function, and I can use that down here. So I can say export const form input. I can set the type to this form control function. All the generics and everything are going to be set up for me. And then I can just set it to essentially a function that's going to return this data, just like that. So this is going to take in some props, and then we can just return this code here. So I'll just copy this up into here, remove this section right here. And if I just make sure that I put the return keyword on here, that cleans up all my code. And now you can see all that extra generic nonsense was removed because I essentially extracted it out into this one single type. And if all this TypeScript nonsense is a little bit confusing and doesn't make sense, that's perfectly okay. This is some complicated code right here. Really, you don't need to understand the TypeScript part though, and all this code is going to be available on GitHub for you to download and actually look at a little bit more in depth if you want to. But now what we want to do, let's say we want to have something for a text area as well. Well, I can come in here, I can get a form text area as well. I can change this component to text area, and literally that's all I need to do. Everything else is hooked up automatically for me. So now inside my page, the entire controller section here where I have my section, I could just say form text area, just like that. I can set the name to description. I can set my control to form.control. I can set my label here, which is just a description. There we go. I can close this off. And also we will probably want to pass in a description. So let's make sure we pass that in as well. There we go. And I can remove this entire controller section. And now all I need to do is hook up this description. So inside my form section where I have this base, I can say description is a React node, just like that. And then I can use that inside my base. I have my description, and I can put that down with my label. So we can say field content, I have my label, and then I'm going to have a field description, which is just my description. And I only want to render this if my description properly is set. So we can say if I have a description, then what I want to do is render out that field description. And I just need to make sure that this is an optional property because I don't need to pass this along. So now you can see that description is being labeled right there inside my section. Now I can do the exact same thing for checkboxes and selects. I'm going to copy over the code, but I'll go through exactly what's happening inside of each particular section. So we're going to need to get our select trigger, select value, and select content. And same thing down here for checkbox. We want to be able to get our checkbox property in. Now, if we take a quick look at our form select, you'll notice that it actually is passing a generic in here because it requires an additional property of children. So we're going to go ahead and add that functionality. So all the way up here where we have our form control function, I'm going to add a generic called extra props. This is going to be extending a record, which is going to be essentially a string and unknown, just like that, because we don't really know what the types are these things are. And then what we can do is we can use those extra props inside of our code right here. So we can say our props is going to include all the original props plus any extra props as well. Now we just need to close off this bracket right here, and that should clean up that code. And if we scroll all the way down a little ways, and we make sure that actually we set a default value for this, and the default is just going to be a record of never. So essentially it's just an empty record that we have no value inside of. That'll clean up these errors. And now you can see for our form select, we have no errors. Essentially all we did is we said, hey, this select element can include some children, and that children is just going to be all of our select content. Otherwise, all we did is we made sure we hooked up all of our different properties correctly. So you can see here our area invalid is being hooked up properly, our ID is being hooked up properly, our onBlur is being hooked up properly. All the different fields that we expect to be hooked up are being hooked up properly for all the different elements that we have. And if we go back into our page, we can actually use that all the way up here where we have this controller for our status. I can use a form select element. And this form select element, as we know, takes in some children, which is just everything inside of our content section right here. And then we just need to hook up the control, which is going to be our form.control. We need to hook up the name here, which is going to be our status. And our label for this one is status. And now I can just delete everything for this entire control, and it's just simplified into this one section right here. Now it looks like we have some styling issues. My guess is I imported my select component from Radix instead. So if we look here, yeah, I imported these from the wrong location. So let's go ahead and actually fix the imports for these. So I want to make sure I import them from my component library. That should fix all those styling issues. Same thing here with the checkbox. import that from the correct location, and there we go. That does clean up our styling. And if we just test this out real quick, you can see that it changed my status to active on this element, so it is working like we expect. Now we want to fix our checkbox, and this one's a little bit interesting because for our checkbox, we want our control, our input here, to be the first element, and we want it to be laid out horizontally. So we have two additional properties, horizontal and control first, that we're going to add to this base section that we're using. So here where we have our children, I'm going to add in horizontal, which is an optional Boolean, and I'm going to add in control first, which again is an optional Boolean that I can now use inside of here. So I can use control first and horizontal to determine my layout for different things. So horizontal is really easy. I can just say here my orientation. If horizontal is true, then we are going to set this to horizontal. Otherwise, we're going to set this to vertical. You'll also notice that we have a responsive layout that we can use as well. Essentially, that makes it horizontal unless you're on a small screen size, and then it changes it to vertical. In our case, actually, we'll just use undefined, so we use the default value specifically. So now we have the ability to set something to horizontal. We just need to make sure we set up what control first is going to do as well. So to make our code a little bit easier to work with, we're going to get our label element, and we're just going to copy all of the code for our label, which is just this right here, and we'll paste that down specifically. And we want to make sure that that is actually inside this render here. So let's just bring this down like that, make this a return, and we're going to take everything for our label element, and we're going to move it directly into there, just like that. That's exactly what we want. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take this entire section and turn that into our control. So we're going to take the calling of all of this code and put that into our control. There we go. So now this can say control, and this entire section right here can say label element, and that at least cleans that up. And now it's much easier for me to essentially say, if I have control first, then I want to render one set of code, otherwise I want to render another set of code. So in the control first way of doing things, I want to essentially render out my label element first, or I'm sorry, my control element first, and then my label element. So we'll copy this into here and swap the order. And same thing here, I want to render them in the normal order if it is not control first. So let's close out of that. Now you can see here it renders first my checkbox, then my label, or it's going to render my label first and then my checkbox. We also need to get this error element as well. So I'm just going to say const error element is equal to, I'm going to copy all the code from here, because again, this will actually need to go inside of this field content section right here. So what I can do in this label element section is I can just remove this field content from here. There we go. That way it's just essentially an element like that. And then what I can do is if my control is not first, I can wrap a field content around this element, and I can add my error down here just so it's like a normal element. Otherwise, if my label is the second thing, well, I'm going to wrap this inside of the field content, and my error is also going to go inside the field content to make it work just like my checkboxes do. So this allows me to essentially have the checkbox layout and the non-checkbox layout for my code. And that cleans up all of that code. We have no errors. So let's come into here and see if this actually works like we expect it to. Here's our checkbox group. Here's our email one specifically. Let's just try to replace this with a form checkbox. This form checkbox needs to take in our control, which is our form control. It needs to take in a label. The label for this one is email. It needs to take in a name. The name for this one is notifications email. And then finally, we have a description or a key, but we don't really have one, so we can just remove that. You can see our email checkbox is there just like before. Now I'm going to copy this over 2 more times, and we're going to do this one, which is going to be text and SMS, and this one is going to be in-app, and this one is going to say push. Now if I give that a little save and I remove these other 2 control elements that we no longer need, there we go. You can now see we have our checkboxes just like before. And if we were to test this code, give it a quick create, you can see SMS and push are true and email is false. And all of our code is so much easier to read. You can see all of our code for all of our elements fits in this one really small section. And if, for example, we have some custom code, like in our case, we have these input groups that are custom code, we can still use the old controller way of doing things. There's nothing preventing us from doing this the old way. We just have some nice helper functions to do some of our most common things related to like checkboxes, or if we have a text area or a select or an input. The most common types of inputs are now really easy to create using this particular method. Now I want to go ahead and move this over to be using TanStack form so I can show you how that works as well, because it's actually quite a bit different and a lot easier in my opinion, because you don't have to worry about any fancy generic stuff inside of TypeScript. So what we're going to do is where we have all of our React hook form stuff, I just want to remove that. So let's just clean up some of our inputs inside of here, right there. And then where we have React hook form at the very top here, I'm just going to remove that entire section completely. So now we have our use form, and the use form that we want to use is actually coming from TanStack. So let's just import that use form, and that is from at TanStack. There we go, React hook form. That's going to give us this use form hook. We have default values that we're going to be passing in. And instead of using resolvers with Zod and everything, instead we have a validators section. And this validators section allows us to have validators for various different functions. In our case, we just want an onSubmit validator. And we're going to set that to our project schema just like this. Now we are going to get some errors. We need to use some fancy TypeScript to fix this. So I'm going to create a type called form data. And this form data is just going to be our z.infer of the type of our project schema, just like that. And essentially what's happening is this default values is what our type is using. So for example, our status is set to a hard-coded string of draft. And you can see that our description here is set to a string while it can also be undefined. So this onSubmit is getting a little confused because this is what's being used for our default value. In our case, what we can do is we can say, hey, I want to make sure that this satisfies this property. So I can say here that my default values satisfies this form data. If this is true, that means that everything inside of here conforms to my form data, which it already does, which makes sense. And then I can cast it to my form data. And by doing that, I essentially overwrite this to make it a slightly more generic type, because now it follows this form data, which says my status can be all these types, my description can be all these types, and so on. So you can see it essentially fixes a lot of the problems that I had inside my code. Now we are still getting an error though, and that's because of the way that Zod does some of its translations. When I use z.infer, if we take a look at this form data, you can see description is not optional. While this onSubmit down here, when I get the data from here, it actually specifies that my description here is an optional property. So it gets a little bit confused. The way that we can fix this really easily is just going into our schema section here and just removing this optional field from here. That'll fix all those little type errors that we have. And now you can see that the type errors have been fixed for this section because that optional property was just getting a little bit confused in the way that TanStack hooked all this stuff up. We also don't need to worry about this field array section because TanStack has its own way of handling that. And we can pass in an onSubmit function. So for this onSubmit function, this is an async function that takes in all of our different value related information, just like that. And essentially, I just want to call all of the code directly inside of here using that value. So we can just replace data with value, and that hooks up all of that code for us. So we don't have to worry about anything else. We now have our onSubmit, our default values, and our validators hooked up. Now inside of our form onSubmit, we need to do this slightly differently. We first need to prevent the default behavior, and then we can just call form.handleSubmit, which is going to call this onSubmit with all of our value information directly inside of it. Now, before we start extracting all of these functions out like we did with React hook form, I first want to create one element that actually is just a normal field inside of TanStack. So what we can do inside of here is I can say that I want my field group, and to create a field, we can say form.field, and we can give it our name. And again, we get type safety because TanStack always has great type safety. And inside of our form field, we need to pass it children, and those children are a render prop, which takes in all of our different field information. So you can see this field property has a bunch of stuff on it. If we say field dot, you can see it's full of a ton of different information. Now what I want to get is the is invalid property, because this is actually a combination of two properties. We can say field.state.meta.isTouched. That just essentially means have we modified this property? And we want to get the field.state.meta.invalid. So we can say is valid, and we want to get the opposite of that. So we're essentially saying, has the user modified this data, and is it currently invalid? If so, then we can say that this is what we're returning. Then what we can return inside of here is our field, just like we did before. We can pass it our data invalid, which is equal to that is invalid property. Then inside of this field, we can get our field label, again, just like we did before. The nice thing about the way that this field component is set up is that everything works the same between different libraries. It's just how you plumb the things together that's slightly different. So for our field label, we can set the HTML here to our field name, just like that. And we can say that this is going to be for our name property. Then we can get our input element. And this actually requires us to set a bunch of different properties because the way that TanStack start works is that it has TanStack form, it has very few default values passed along. So we need to get the field.name as our ID. We need to get the name, which is our field.name. We need to get the value, which is equal to our field.state.value. We want to get the onChange, which is just going to be field.handleChange. And we want to get the property from here and pass it to the e.target.value, just like that. We also want to do the exact same thing with onBlur field.state, or sorry, not state, handle blur. There we go. That's going to hook up our blur event listener. And then finally, we need the area invalid. That's going to be for specifically Shadcn. We can say is invalid. So we have to hook up all of these different things. And then finally, if we have something that's invalid, then we can render out our field error by saying errors is equal to our field.state.meta.errors. There we go. close all that off, and I have one extra bracket there. There we go. And that is essentially how we create a field inside of TanStack. It's relatively straightforward. We use this form.field. This is essentially the same as control from the actual React hook library. Then we use our field label, and field error exactly the same. The only difference is how we pass along all of our field properties to the input specifically. Now we could go through and create one for every single one of these the long way, or we can just jump straight to creating the more advanced way of doing things. And to do that, I'm going to create a brand new folder inside of here. I'm going to call this form to put all of my TanStack form related stuff. Now the nice thing is TanStack form has a built-in way to handle all of this, and we're going to create a brand new file. We're going to call this one hooks.tsx, and inside of here, we're going to create essentially a constant variable, which is going to be set to equal to create form hook context. There we go. This is going to give us our context information, which is field context, form context, use field context, and use form context. This allows us to essentially create our own custom hook that we can use inside of our application. So we can create a form hook, and this create form hook function makes us pass in, first of all, the field context, and it makes us pass in a form context, but it also allows us to pass in custom field components, which is going to be an object, and custom form components, which is an object as well. And these custom components are what we can use in our application. So similarly to how I created my own custom components, such as if we take a look, we have here our form base, and below that we had our form input, form text area, form select, and we had to manually pass along all the types for everything. This is all handled automatically for us with this create form hook function. And this returns to us a brand new hook called use app form, just like this. There we go. So now we have this brand new function we can use inside of our application, and we can use it directly where we would normally use the use form function. So where we use form, we just replace that with use app form. And now if I make sure I export this, so I can say export the hooks from here, there we go, get all those exported. Now if I import this into here properly, everything is going to work exactly the same as before. You can see we have no errors in this section, and if we scroll down, we have no errors inside of this section. The really nice thing though is now instead of a normal field, I can use an app field. The app field works exactly the same as the normal field, but now this field property has access to all of the custom values I pass into my field components and my form components. So let's create a brand new component called input, and we're going to call this form input to match the naming from our other component. What we can do now is we can create a brand new file, or you can do it in the same file, it doesn't matter. I'm going to call this form input.tsx, export function form input, just like that. And for now, we'll just return null, just so I can show you how this works. We can see we can import that correctly. And now inside of here, I have access to that particular property. So I can say field.input, and that's because I named this input right here. And this will allow me to render out, essentially, whatever I put inside that section. Right now, it's just rendering null, but if I just put the text hi in there, it'll render out that text hi for us. Now to actually see what's rendering on our page, I'm going to take all of the code down here and just comment it out for now, so at least we can have our page working. Give that a quick comment, and now if we save, you can see that everything is rendering out exactly as it did before. Now we are getting a little bit of an error. Our field.app is working here, and the reason we're not getting our code is because we're not actually rendering it. There we go. Let's put our field input, and you can see that text hi shows up. So we can use this field input anywhere to get a bunch of different information. And we have access to our field context and our form context, which gives us all the information we need. For example, in this form input, I can get my field information by saying use field context, just like this. And now I get all that same field information that I was getting before, all this information directly inside of here without having to do any fancy TypeScript stuff. So now inside of here, all of this code that I was using for my field, I essentially want to copy all of this code, and I want to use that directly inside of here. So let's just copy all of that code. We'll come into this form input, and this is where I want to return all of that different code. So we'll come in just like this, make sure I import the field properly, make sure I get that from, there we go, right here. Don't need to worry about that section. Get our field label inputted, get our input imported, and then finally our field error, make sure that's imported. And finally, the only thing you'll notice we get an error with is this value, and that is because all the way up here, we need to actually just tell it what the value is. In our case, we know that our value will always be a string, so we can say the value is a string. Now, if we give that a quick save and we go back into our application, we can essentially replace all of this code with just a single field input. So I can just remove all of this, put just field input like that, and my code is going to work exactly the same as before. Give that a quick save. You can see we get this name. When I click create, it's not going to work because it's expecting all of these other properties up here we haven't defined yet, but you can see I've drastically simplified my code to essentially a single line just like I had before, and I had no fancy TypeScript stuff that I had to worry about. It was rather quite simple. I do want to extract this a little bit to make it a little bit more generic by creating a base version of this, just like we did with the React hook form version. So let's go into that React hook form version. And I essentially want to take everything that's inside of my base. We'll just copy this entire function. So we'll just copy that, create a brand new component called form base.tsx. And we'll just export all of this code from here. And we can simplify this drastically. We don't need any generic types, so let's just completely remove all the generic types from this. We will want to have some form base props. There we go, form base props. We don't need our control, so we can get rid of that completely. And up inside of here, we can create our type, form base props. Our form base props have a specific type, and we can have our form control props as well. Our form control props, we already know what needs to be passed along. We need our label, which is a string, and we need a description, which is an optional string, just like that. That's the exact same stuff we were passing along inside the React hook firm version. If we look up here, you can see name, label, description, control. We just don't need the control portion anymore or the name portion anymore because all that's handled automatically. So we can get rid of that name portion here. Inside of our base props here, we need children, which is just going to be a simple React node, no fancy TypeScript needed. We have that horizontal property, which is an optional Boolean. And then we have the exact same thing for control first, just like that. And we also want to make sure we have all of these original props in here, just like that. So you can see all of our properties are showing up. Just obviously all the stuff inside of here is going to be quite a bit different. The first thing we can do is we can get our field. So we can say field equals use field context. There we go, just like we did before, we now have our field. We can also get our is invalid section. So let me just copy that from here. There we go, paste that down. So now we have that invalid property as well. And then we need to get essentially our label element. So let's just get our label element up here. We need to be able to get our control and our error element. So let's paste all of those down, get all of our imports from the correct location. Get that. We don't need to call this children function, so we don't have to worry about that as much. But we do need to make sure that we get our field error into here as well. So this control element, I can actually just remove completely because it's just going to be calling children. For this controller, we don't actually need this at all, so we can remove that. All these different label elements and everything. Essentially, we just want to return the field section like that. Let me just clean up our code, so at least that's working. Import the field from the correct location and make sure we get our field content imported. There we go. And now instead of control, this should just say children because we're just rendering out the children as is. And then to be able to get our invalid properties, we just have that is invalid. So we can just replace this with is invalid. And then to get our errors, we can just replace this with our field.meta. State.meta.errors. There we go. And that's going to render out our error element information. So now we can essentially clean up this form input quite drastically. We know we need to pass along some specific props into here, which is our form control props. I think from my base value, wherever that is at, let's see, I probably need to export this. There we go. There we go. We now have our form control props, which we can use directly inside of here. Import that. Now we have all of our prop information, and we just need to make sure we pass that along properly. So here we can say that we have our form base, passing it in all of those different props, and then we pass it in a children element, which is just going to be our import element, just like that. Get rid of all this field stuff down here, and that cleaned up all of our code perfectly, and now everything should be working exactly as we expect it to. We can clean up some of these import errors that we no longer need. There we go. And inside the page here, you can see we just need to pass along our elements, which is our label. And in our case, the label is name, and that cleaned up our code. And now you can see we have that name property showing up. And the great thing is I can copy this down and I can do the exact same thing for text area. This one is going to be description, and it's going to have a description property. And the description property on this, we can just copy over. You can just see it's this right here. So let's just paste that directly into there. And now all we need to do is define a brand new text area component. So we can say text area, form text area, just like that. I'm going to make it lowercase just because I find that works a little bit better, looks a little bit cleaner. Come back into here, make this lowercase as well. There we go. You can see that solved the errors in this section. All we need to do is implement this form text area. So our form input, we can just copy that, form text area. We can now call this form text area, just like that. And all we need to do is just use a text area instead of an input. So we can say text area, just like that. And boom, that cleaned up all of our code perfectly fine inside of our application. And if we import this, everything should work without an error. And now you can see we have our description section down here, but it looks like we have a little bit of an error between things being hooked up. That's because this should have a description as its name. There we go. So now you can see if I change this and change this, they are independent from one another. And now we can move on to the next section, which is going to be our section for our status. So we can say status, and this is going to be our status. And this one we want to be a select element. Now this one is quite easy for us to create as well. I can come into here and I can create a form select.tsx. I'm going to paste in the code for this one because it's relatively straightforward. The only difference is we now have this children prop we're passing in, and it's super simple. We don't have generics or anything to worry about. We just say, hey, we have a children prop and it's going to be a React node, and then all of our normal props we had before. We're using the exact same select related content we were using before. So to hook things up for the select, we just need to make sure we hook up the on value change and the value property correctly. We need to make sure we hook up our ID, our on blur, and everything else properly inside of our application. And I believe this on blur should actually be moved here to the select trigger because that's the thing that's actually being blurred for this particular application. So that's how we just set up our select element. And now inside of here, to make sure our select is working for this section, we need to go into our hooks and say our select is our form select element. Now we give that a quick save, come over here, give this a save, and we go into this application. Looks like we're having an import error. This comes from form base. There we go. And now we can see that our statuses look like they're working, but they're not quite working because we need to pass along the children. So instead of our form select, we need to pass along all of the different children properties. So I can just copy these over because they're exactly the same as our other one, paste that down, and now you can see all of our different values are being passed in. And if I were to submit my form, of course it's not working because we still need to fill in the rest of our elements that are missing. Because right now, all we've done is these two sections. We need to do this next section for all of our different notifications. So I'm just going to copy this entire section up, paste it into here so we can use it. And of course, we need to just change this to use our form fields that we have inside of here. And we want to use a select, or a checkbox actually. So here we can say checkbox just like this. We can change what the name is right there. And the label is going to be email. That takes care of this one right here. And we can copy this over for our other two. So this one is going to be SMS and text, SMS, text, and this one is actually the push notification one in app. There we go. Let's get rid of these two checkboxes because now we have them. And we just need to create that checkbox component. Again, creating that component is quite straightforward. We can say form checkbox.tsx. We can paste that in. And essentially this one is, again, exactly the same. We're getting all the different properties that we need for our is invalid and so on. The only difference really in this one is we're just making sure we hook up our on check change and our on blur properly. And for our on check change, this E property is technically a checked state, which can be intermediate or a Boolean. So we just want to make sure that it's a Boolean of true. And we also are passing along control first and horizontal to make sure the layout is in the correct order that we want. Then we can just pass it into here by saying checkbox. And this one is going to be form checkbox, just like that. Give it a save, and now you can see we have all three of our checkboxes working properly. And the final thing we have to do is our user section at the very bottom. And again, we can copy over what that looks like. So let's get rid of all of this code that we've already copied. And I will copy over this final section for all of our code inside of here, because this is essentially just going to be an entirely custom one, just like we had for everything else. So we can get rid of this entire commented out section just to clean up our code a little bit. And now we want to make sure this works because right now we're using a bunch of controllers and everything, which is not ideal. So the first thing we can do here is we can wrap all of this inside of a field section. So here, what we want to do inside of our section is we want to take our form and we want to get a field. We could do app field or normal field. It doesn't really matter. We'll just do app field to get all of our custom stuff. The name for this one is our user section, and we can specify the mode as array. And this essentially allows us to do all that array stuff that we talked about. So this gives us a field that we can use with all of the code that we want to render out inside of our section. And then with this code that we want to render out is essentially this entire field set section. So let me just take that code, put it inside of a turn right there, and that'll clean up that section. So now we have access to this field, which has some specific properties on it. If we look on this field section, we actually have the ability to add specific values and remove specific values from here. So we have push and we have remove. Those are the two functions that we can use to add and remove things. Next thing I want to do here is I want to get my field.state.meta.errors. If I have any errors, then I want to render them out just like I was doing for everything else. So let's just put those directly inside of here, clean that section up. Next, we have that push value function. So we can say field.pushValue. I want to push in a new user with an empty email. That's going to clean that section up. And then inside of my field group section, this is where we loop through all of our values. So we can say field.state.value. This gives us all of our user information. We don't even need the user because our key here can just be an index, just like that. And this is going to be on a brand new form.app field or normal field. It doesn't really matter. Our name for this one needs to be slightly different. Instead of the periods here, we use the bracket notation followed by a period here. So it's just a slightly different format for that. Obviously, we don't need a control. And instead of a render function here, we're going to have children. So let's just close this section off. We'll bring this all the way down to here, just like that. And then we want to have our children inside of here. So it's going to say field, which is a function that is then going to return some data inside of it. So let's just clean that section up. And I believe this will go right here. We need to have a parenthesis in there somewhere, I'm sure. I believe it needs to go right here. And actually, yeah, that needs to be a parenthesis there. This one right here needs to be a bracket. And it looks like we're getting pretty close to getting all this cleaned up. There we go, that gets all of our different errors fixed there. Let's just make sure we put a return on this particular section. There we go. So now inside of our code, we have an inner field, and this inner field is each individual user itself. So now we can do things such as like is our inner field invalid and so on. So let's get that is invalid property. I'll just copy this over because this we've done a million times over. You can see we could just check our inner field to make sure it's touched and that it is currently invalid. And if it's invalid, we can use that right there to get that invalid property. Now we need to be able to get that import group import and all of that different stuff. Here we can pass along that invalid property, make sure that this is imported properly. And actually the reason we're getting an error here is because we need to pass along all of our properties. For example, we need to pass along the onBlur, and this onBlur is just going to be inner field.blur. We need to pass along an onChange. That's going to be our inner field.handleChange, e.target.value, just like that. And we need to make sure here we use our inner field for the ID property as well. That cleaned up all of that information for our input group. Here we can use our field.remove value to remove that specific user. And then here we can just check if it is invalid. Then we want to render out our inner field.errors. So we want to get our state.meta.errors. There we go. That should clean up all that different code. And now we have our section down here. Let's just try to see if this form works. If we specify some specific information, select and create, and you can see it passes along all that information. Now it didn't clear out our form successfully. I believe that might just be because we're on essentially like a new render of the page. It was having some caching issues. So let me just come in here. I'm going to fix my label so it's a capital D on that. Let's pass in some random information. We can actually just leave that off. Check both of these. Add in a user email, and we'll click create, and you can see that that passed along all of our information just like we expected it to, but it still didn't clear our form. So I figured out what the error was. I just forgot to pass along the value here. We should be passing along our inner field.value, state.value. There we go. That now should hopefully fix our problem. Let's go in here with a name and an email, and when we submit, you can see that user email was cleared out. Now I went pretty quickly through all of this TanStack form stuff, so if you want to see an in-depth tutorial on everything there is to TanStack form, I'm going to link a video right over here. I'm still working on the video, so it's not quite live, but as soon as it is, it'll be linked right over there. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.